Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into something pretty fascinating, Pietro Ubaldi's Cristo.
That's right. And think of this as, well, your personal guide into Ubaldi's really quite unique take on Christ. He's not just, repeating the usual ideas.
No.
No, he's using logic and reason, really trying to explore this central figure. And it's important to remember, you've given us bits from the final volume of this massive 24-book series.
24 volumes.
Yeah, a lifetime of thinking kind of distilled right there.
Okay, let's try and unpack this huge undertaking then. A 24-volume life's work. That alone tells you something about the journey Ubaldi was on.
Definitely.
And in Cristo, he's tackling, well, everything it seems. Christ himself, the concept of the fall, big social questions, and this idea he calls the universal law. It feels really comprehensive.
It absolutely is. And Ubaldi himself says, his goal is to interpret Christ in a way that works for people of faith, but also for, let's say, thinkers, people who really value reason.
Right. Trying to bridge that gap.
Sort of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He's after a deeper truth, something maybe more broadly acceptable than just, poetic beauty. He wants us to see Christ not just historically, but cosmically, divinely,
Okay.
as a representative of what he calls the Father and the law. Basically, a guide leading humanity from what he terms the anti-system, or AS,
Okay.
back towards the system, or S. So the key thing for you right off the bat is this idea of a big cosmic journey from imperfection towards perfection.
The anti-system and the system AS&S, that definitely sparks curiosity. So before we dive right into Christ, maybe we should get a handle on Ubaldi's basics. His ideas about God and creation, he uses this term tudo uno deus. What's that about?
Tudo uno deus. It basically means all one God. And the crucial takeaway here for you is Ubaldi's pretty radical idea that everything, the whole universe, isn't really separate from God.
Oh.
It's more like a direct expression of God. He suggests God, being literally all there is, had to manifest the universe, which he calls S, the system, right out of his own substance.
Out of his own substance, so like an extension.
Yeah, think of it like an emanation, a kind of continuous outpouring of the divine essence itself.
Okay, so the system S comes directly from God's own being. And he talks about a first creation too, and whether it was eternal or not. Why does that matter for his argument?
Well, that question, eternal or specific beginning, it touches on the nature of divine will, where everything really started.
Yeah.
But honestly, whether there was a distinct moment of creation, like we might imagine,
Right.
Ubaldi mainly emphasizes that S is the full realization of God's original plan. The core idea to hold on to is that everything just stems from this one unified divine source.
Okay, but then the obvious question comes up, doesn't it? If God is perfect, all-encompassing, why create beings who can mess up, who can cause this fall he talks about? Seems like a contradiction.
It's a huge question, yeah. And Ubaldi tackles it head on. He basically argues that real perfection includes freedom.
Includes freedom. How so?
Well, he says true perfection isn't about making beings that can't err because they have no choice. It's about granting real freedom, genuine autonomy to conscious beings who can learn, who can self-correct, even if that means mistakes happen, within the bounds of God's law, of course. He sort of asks, what's more perfect? Flawless robots or free beings who might stumble but are ultimately guided by the logic of the law to find their way back? It's about valuing that journey, the self-discovery.
That actually makes a lot of sense. Freedom has to include the possibility of, well, going off track. Which brings us to this evolutive cycle he mentions, triggered by a revolt within the system. Sounds dramatic. Can you break that down?
Yeah, it does sound dramatic. What's really fascinating is Ubaldi's suggesting the potential for this duality for the anti-system was somehow latent even within the original unity of S. He talks about a revolt, maybe a kind of desire to expand beyond the positive limits, leading to a negative turn. That's what births this dualistic reality we're in. Think of it like a pendulum swinging away from the center point, S into duality, AS, before it inevitably swings back.
Okay.
So involution is the swing outward, spirit descending into matter. Evolution is the return trip, matter ascending back towards spirit. And Ubaldi says, our world, we're in that reconstructive evolutionary phase right now, always striving back towards the harmony of S.
So with that huge backdrop creation, the fall into duality, this evolutionary journey back, how does Ubaldi reinterpret Christ? What's the core of his different view?
Well, Ubaldi deliberately shifts focus away from purely human takes on Christ and more towards his fundamental essence, the real meaning of his coming to earth, his suffering, the passion, and how he relates to this universal law and divine redemption.
Right.
He asks these key questions. Who was Christ? And what did he want to do? What ends did he propose to achieve? And Ubaldi is clear. To really get Christ in his framework, you, the listener, need to first grasp the creation and fall dynamics he lays out elsewhere.
And how does Christ fit into that big evolutionary story? Was he like an unexpected interruption or part of the plan?
Oh, definitely part of the plan, more integrated. Ubaldi presents Christ as representing a really advanced stage in a long, ongoing evolutionary process, not some, random miracle dropped in unprepared.
Okay.
His passion, that intense suffering and sacrifice, it becomes a powerful model for all the trials and tribulations every single soul goes through in the anti-system over millennia before they can finally get back to the system.
So Christ's journey is like a compressed version of everyone else's potential path.
Exactly. An intensely lived example of that universal return journey.
And the resurrection, that's so central to traditional belief. How does Ubaldi see that through his lens?
For Ubaldi, the resurrection takes on this broader, almost cosmic meaning. It's not just about surviving physical death.
Right.
It represents the absolute definitive victory over the anti-system itself.
Yeah.
A triumphant return to the Father, completing that whole FS cycle he talks about.
Sass.
He even suggests that earlier generations, because they didn't have our modern understanding of evolution, couldn't fully grasp the depth of that victory. Not in the way we maybe can now, with this wider view.
That's a really powerful point. Evolution gives a timeline, a process that earlier thinkers just didn't have in the same way. So what's the main message Ubaldi thinks Christ was sending?
The core message, according to Ubaldi, is incredibly direct. Do as I did. What I achieved, you can potentially achieve too. He really stresses that Christ was part of our shared human journey. Not some fundamentally separate miracle, but someone who reached a higher evolutionary stage. He contrasts this with traditional views, which he sees as more rooted in, myth, less aligned with how we now understand the universe works according to laws.
He also seems to push back against the traditional idea of God being, anthropomorphic, like a person.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Ubaldi argues we need a concept of God that comes from the universe itself, not just from human experience or our limited understanding. He sees the traditional personal God, often with very human-like emotions, as a product of the same thinking that created, say, pagan gods historically. And this leads him to ask a really challenging question. Is the whole idea of God becoming human? Is that somehow an echo of the original revolt, that primal desire to become like God?
That's a heavy question. Does Ubaldi think this different, more cosmic view of Christ makes him less great or less significant?
Not at all. Actually, the opposite. Ubaldi argues that seeing Christ through this evolutionary cosmic lens actually elevates our understanding of his intelligence, his true nature.
Right.
Yeah, he sees it as moving away from static, fixed ideas towards something more dynamic, more logically coherent. He even poses a counter question for you. Who achieved more? Someone who only ever knew good, or someone who experienced both good and evil and consciously chose to return to the good?
Interesting comparison.
He concludes they're both significant, obviously, but their achievements are maybe of a different kind.
Okay, let's dig deeper into this conflict then between the system and anti-system S and AS, especially in Christ's passion. Ubaldi suggests Christ kind of provoked his enemies. Why would he do that?
Ubaldi sees Christ's actions as very deliberate, intentional, designed to reveal deep truths, to expose how the AS actually works by showing its reactions to him.
So not just a passive victim.
Not at all. There was a calculated aspect aimed at showing the nature of the forces he was up against.
No, one of the toughest parts of traditional theology for many people is that idea of a just father needing an innocent Christ to pay for everyone else's sins. How does Ubaldi handle that?
Yeah, Ubaldi finds that specific concept pretty problematic through his lens of divine justice and the universal law.
How so?
He really emphasizes the principle that each individual has to take responsibility for their own evolutionary journey, work through their own stuff. That inner transformation, he argues, just can't be transferred or done by proxy.
Right, you can't outsource it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even questions if Christ's individual suffering is really proportionate to the massive cumulative suffering of billions over millennia. It doesn't quite square with his idea of cosmic balance.
And this leads into the whole concept of sacrifice, which is so huge in religion. Ubaldi traces how that idea evolved over time. What does he point out there?
He sees a clear progression, doesn't he? From early, very material, often bloody sacrifices, literal animals, sometimes even humans,
Yeah, grim stuff.
towards more and more symbolic, immaterial forms. like the Eucharist, which he views as a kind of leftover, a vestige of those older ways. He notes how humanity historically relied on shedding blood to approach the divine, and the ongoing struggle to move past that as spiritual understanding grows.
So, given that evolving view of sacrifice, how does Ubaldi reinterpret Christ's passion? What's the new meaning he finds?
He sees the Passion as the ultimate lived example of evolutionary overcoming.
Overcoming.
Yes, the most profound, real-world demonstration of breaking free from the limits of the AS and victoriously returning to the higher order of the S. This event, he thinks, benefits both sides. The AS, negatively, by losing a powerful positive influence, and the S, positively, by being strengthened.
So it wasn't about appeasing God through suffering.
Not in Ubaldi's view, it was about powerfully demonstrating a process of fundamental transformation that's possible for everyone.
He also highlights Christ's refusal to be an earthly king. Why was that choice so significant in Ubaldi's framework?
Christ deliberately turned down that lure of worldly power, didn't he? Choosing instead a reign based on lasting spiritual values. Ubaldi argues that's precisely why Christ's influence has lasted for millennia, unlike the often temporary power of earthly rulers who rely on force.
Ubaldi then walks us through the different figures in the Passion, Judas, Caiaphas, Pilate, and stresses how they just didn't get Christ's real mission. What's the main takeaway from that part?
The core insight there is the stark contrast between two totally different ideas of authority.
Okay.
You've got the state's authority, human power within the AS, versus the authority of God's universal law within the S. People like Pilate and Herod, they were completely operating within earthly concerns, politics, keeping order.
Right, practicalities.
They just couldn't grasp Christ's idea of a spiritual kingdom, his mission to witness to a truth that went way beyond their world. Pilate's famous question, what is truth? That sums up the total incomprehension, doesn't it?
It really does. So it looks like the AS, the anti-system, wins initially with the crucifixion. But Ubaldi says it's actually a defeat for the AS. How does that work?
Well, yeah, it might look like the AS won by silencing Christ.
Yeah.
But Ubaldi argues that victory was just superficial, temporary.
How?
Christ's essence, his true being, actually escaped the domain of the AS.
Yeah.
It returned to the S, which is inherently beyond the AS's reach, beyond its destructive power. The AS can only affect what belongs to its realm, the material, the temporary. Christ's spirit went beyond that.
And the resurrection then becomes the key proof of this victory over death, which Ubaldi links to the AS.
Exactly. The resurrection, especially the detail about the physical body disappearing and him reappearing in a non-physical form, serves as the ultimate confirmation. His triumph over the AS through the power of life, which comes from the S.
Right.
Ubaldi even suggests the more mythological bits around the resurrection were maybe necessary for earlier minds to grasp this huge victory before a more scientific understanding of evolution was available.
Which brings us to his idea of demythification, moving away from these symbolic mythical understandings. He sees that as a necessary part of human evolution.
Yes, he views it as a natural progression of consciousness, moving from, say, primitive instincts towards sentiment, ideal love, and eventually using reason and logic.
But he adds a caution.
Yeah, he does. He cautions against throwing out old beliefs too quickly before a better, more solid understanding is ready to replace them. Doing that, he warns, can actually mess up the evolutionary function those old beliefs served in guiding people.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly to the method of nonviolence that Christ taught. Ubaldi acknowledges it seems to clash with basic biology, the struggle for survival. How does he square that?
He tackles that apparent clash by pointing to the dualistic nature of our world, the interplay between what he calls masculine positive, assertive, active, and feminine negative, receptive, defensive principles.
Okay.
Christ, he argues, mainly focused on regulating that masculine principle by introducing higher moral norms. He strongly condemned what he saw as the male sins, greed, hypocrisy, like with the Pharisees. But his approach to female sins was often more compassionate, like with the repentant Magdalene.
And he makes an interesting point that this isn't strictly about biological sex, right?
Sure.
More about personality.
Exactly. He suggests it's the underlying personality structure, not physical gender, that determines which principle someone leans towards, which helps explain why people don't always fit neat stereotypes. He also notes how people, even nations, might adopt the gospel message on the surface, but still act out their deeper tendencies.
Ubaldi quotes Gibran here, showing Jesus not just as meek, but spiritually strong. How does that connect to non-resistance as Ubaldi sees it?
Ubaldi, using Gibran's insight, argues that offer the other cheek, wasn't meant for the vulnerable to just accept abuse.
No.
No, it was a specific challenge aimed at the powerful, the aggressors, the strong, intended to make them stop and think, to correct their behavior. It wasn't a universal rule for the powerless who could be hurt worse by it.
He even suggests that the way the church historically portrayed Christ, maybe emphasizing certain things over others, was a kind of necessary adaptation for its survival. That seems unconventional.
Ubaldi sees it less as a flaw in Christ's original teaching and more as a pragmatic, maybe even necessary, adjustment to the historical realities the early church faced. He suggests that without those tweaks and emphasis, the message might not have survived through the centuries to reach us at all.
And how does this all link up with individual redemption? Ubaldi says it's not instant, but gradual.
He really stresses that true redemption is slow, careful, analytical work guided by the wisdom of the universal law. The law, he believes, works constructively, can even turn negative forces towards something useful when they meet positive ones.
Okay.
He pictures a personality as like a bundle of forces moving in a direction. And in the AS, that often leads to conflict, dissatisfaction. The law allows errors, but sees them as crucial chances to learn and correct. As we consciously work on our flaws through experience, we gradually redeem our whole self.
He also contrasts the suffering in the AS with Christ's suffering. What's the main difference?
He draws a line between the dark, often resentful, unproductive suffering that comes from the negativity of the AS and the luminous, even blessed suffering Christ experienced within the S.
Luminous suffering.
Yeah. Christ's suffering, in Ubaldi's view, was a conscious, willing participation in the loss process of restoring order and guiding evolution. As we evolve, we become more like conscious partners with the law in fixing our own issues.
Let's talk about the offended and the offender and their destinies. There seems to be a tension between justice and forgiveness. How does Ubaldi reconcile that?
Ubaldi argues forgiveness isn't actually against justice. It's a more refined, more effective way of achieving true justice within the law's framework. It's not about saying harm doesn't matter, but about entrusting the response to the law's higher wisdom, which is impartial and sees the long game, unlike human vengeance.
So what are the benefits of forgiving them, for both sides?
For the person wronged, forgiveness brings security in the law's order and frees them psychologically from the offender. The offender, meanwhile, faces the natural consequences guided by the law, which aims to educate, correct, and eventually bring them back into harmony. That's very different from just human punishment.
He uses the phrase justice by delegation. What does that mean here?
It means consciously choosing to let the law handle justice, instead of seeking personal revenge or imposing our own biased judgment. For those trying to live by the system's principles within the tricky AS, Ubaldi suggests aligning with these higher principles, including forgiveness, is the most direct path to growth and well-being.
And Ubaldi says two opposing ways of living emerge from this, the involuted and the evolved. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The involuted are those driven mainly by lower instincts, ego, often leading to conflict and suffering in the AS. The evolved, however, consciously try to align themselves with the universal law's principles. Ubaldi repeats that his big goal is to give a rational, positive understanding of the gospel, presenting Christ in a way modern minds can connect with, reinterpreting what he sees as a misunderstood truth. He describes the evangelical man as someone living for the whole, and in return for doing their part, they receive the whole's protection.
And how does his principle of righteousness fit into all this?
Ubaldi sees Christ's main mission as showing the Father's law to humanity, and that inevitably caused conflict with the world at a lower evolutionary stage. This conflict, he argues, isn't just simple right versus wrong.
No.
No, it's a natural result of the huge evolutionary distance between Christ's understanding and the general consciousness back then.
So both Christ and the world had their own sort of internal logic, their own reasons based on where they were evolutionarily.
Precisely. The opposition came directly from that gap. Ubaldi stresses that life without evolution is basically wasted potential. Each stage has its own work to do. The evolved person living in the AS survives and grows by consciously aligning with the positive principles of the S.
And Christ himself is that crucial link between AS and S, bridging that massive gap.
Exactly. And righteousness, honesty, integrity, justice, that's the healing principle brought from the higher realm, S, into the imperfect one, AS, to lift it up, to redeem it. Living by the law, even in the tough conditions of the AS, isn't just possible, it is the whole point of evolving.
And he thinks evolution actually favors righteousness over aggression in the long run.
Yes, as the world becomes more interconnected, more organic, Righteousness becomes more valuable, more advantageous than just brute force.
He even applies this economically, suggesting unfairly gained wealth has a negative quality.
Yeah, he really underscores that morals and ethics are fundamental to the real, lasting value of anything humans do, including business. Negativity is like a disease of the AS, and the positivity from the S aims to heal it through evolution, with righteousness being the cure, the prevailing force.
But he acknowledges that right now, it often looks like the strong do beat the honest. How does he explain that?
He explains that different methods, force versus righteousness, work better at different stages. In individualistic chaos, force might seem to win. But evolution is the journey away from that, towards collective order, where righteousness becomes a smarter, stronger strategy. He talks about life developing antibodies, corrective reactions to negativity.
And the universal law isn't just written rules for him.
No, far from it. It governs everything, every movement, every thought, with built-in consequences. It's like a constant school, always giving feedback for correction. Happiness, he says, comes through evolving, and righteousness is the condition of greatest power and advantage. Even suffering can be a catalyst, the effort needed to ascend.
He wraps this up by stressing how interconnected understanding the law, living by it, and evolving towards the S really are.
Achieving a clear vision of the law, he suggests, is almost like seeing God's thoughts. The good we do, the positive qualities we build, they become permanent, indestructible inner achievements we keep beyond death. But progress takes personal effort, lived experience, not just reading about it. Christ showed the way, but we each have to walk it.
He mentions 3 ways to approach this vision of God: emotional, intellectual, and practical realization, suggesting Ubaldi's work touches all 3.
Right. He sees more esoteric or mystical paths as maybe catering to earlier stages of intellectual development. The real vision of God, he argues, involves seeing through the AS to its guiding center, the S, seeing its beauty beneath the distortions. Our inability to see God now, he thinks, is just due to underdeveloped spiritual eyes, which evolution will fix. This vision has rational aspects, but also ecstatic ones. It connects us spiritually to the S, brings order to our lives, and lightens the load of suffering as we evolve.
And he ends by acknowledging his own journey of learning, wanting to share, but also stressing that truly understanding the law takes personal effort. The climb.
Precisely. It's not passive. It requires active participation in this whole dynamic process of evolution and understanding.
So to kind of wrap up this deep dive into Ubaldi's Christo, we've really explored his unique angle on Christ as this key evolutionary figure, navigating the big tensions between the system and the anti-system.
Yeah.
He gives us these fresh takes on core religious ideas like sacrifice, resurrection, all through that evolutionary lens, and keeps coming back to righteousness as the guiding principle for our journey back towards us.
What really stands out for me, thinking about you, the learner, is Ubaldi's bold attempt to bridge that gap between faith and reason.
Yeah.
To present a Christ that resonates not just with believers, but also with critical thinkers.
Right.
That huge cosmic scope, his focus on underlying universal laws, it offers a genuinely different framework for understanding Christ's mission and why he still matters.
For me, one of the most, mind-bending things from Ubaldi's analysis is the implication that our current understanding, even of really fundamental truths, might just be one phase, one temporary stop in this massive cosmic evolution.
That's a great point.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other bedrock beliefs might get totally reinterpreted or seen in a new light as our collective understanding keeps expanding?
That is the perfect thought to leave you with. If our current understanding is just one stage in an ongoing cosmic evolution, what other seemingly fundamental truths might be reinterpreted down the line? It's a deeply provocative question that flows right out of Ubaldi's work.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Pietro Ubaldi's Christo. If you have other sources, other readings you'd like us to tackle in future deep dives, definitely send them our way.
Please do.
Until our next exploration, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deeper.